All right, thank you all for coming tonight. We're going to continue with our post-Maimonidean and late medieval study of dogma. And we mentioned last week the quote by Menachem Kellner about the impact of Rambam. And he says that the impact of Maimonides' position that, in short, Judaism has dogmas in the strictest sense of the word, was monumental and pervasive, while at the same time negligible. So he kind of sets up this dichotomy. Rambam's influence was at the same time influential and pervasive in its scope and in its long-term impact, but yet he also describes it as negligible. And we argued a number of reasons why, even though, in our first class, Vivian mentioned the Anima Amins and, recognized initially that and immediately that when I asked, are there obligatory beliefs in Judaism, Rambam's were the ones that came to mind. So it shows the far-reaching and the long-term appeal and impact of Rambam. Yet at the same time, Kellner argues that the influence was negligible. And so even if we do say the Anima means after Shachari, perhaps, or even if we say kind of the gist of them in Yigdal, it's still, even though it's preserved in our liturgy, it's still just kind of a very superficial long-range impact of what Rambam really felt, the sophistication, the intricacies of the conceptions that one must believe in Judaism. And even more than that, we saw that there were about 200 years where this really wasn't a topic of discussion. This really wasn't on the minds of philosophers. And it wasn't for 2 centuries when this concept of dogma in Judaism was really revisited and revitalized in the late medieval period. And so we saw that a couple of classes ago when we looked at the influence of the Rashbats, Reb Shimon ben Samach Duran. And we saw that also last week when we looked at the influence of Chasdai Kreskas. And Chasdai Kreskas kind of came out most oppositional to Rambam. He was an anti-Aristotelian. He very much rejected or objected to the intellectual focus of Rambam that was influenced by Aristotle, and wanted to kind of revert back to a much purer type of Judaism, a more conservative type of Judaism, where really the focus was not on intellectual development or the human perfection, was really on one's love of God and one's performance of the mitzvot. So he took issue with a number of Rambam's conceptions. We talked about whether or not one could even be obligated to believe altogether. And he kind of systematized a very different hierarchy of dogma than we see in Rambam's kind of equal 13 principles of faith. So going along those terms, I want to look at today Kreskas' student and see how was he influenced by Rambam's impact, but how did he also deviate from Rambam, perhaps based on the influence of his teacher, Chasdai Kreskas. And so once again, just like we saw with the 2 previous philosophers, it wasn't until this late medieval period when there were a lot of tensions, when there was a lot of historical animosity, persecutions, that this concept of dogma, this whole discussion of dogma was really revitalized. And it was not just rediscussed among the philosophers, but it was specifically tackled by the philosophers who were also simultaneously religious leaders, political leaders, communal leaders at this very trying and hostile time in Jewish history. So we looked at Chasdai Kreskas last week. I want to devote today's class to Yosef Albo. So Yosef Albo was Kreskas' student and was influenced, as we're going to see today, by Kreskas. However, he also deviated from Kreskas in some important ways. Yosef Albo wrote what is often considered the most popular work of Jewish dogma, and he calls it the Sefer HaIkarim, the Book of Principles. And it's the most popular among the corpus of medieval classics and medieval Jewish philosophy because of its accessible style. It was written in Hebrew. It was written in a very kind of simple style that was very accessible to the masses. So that's why it had far-reaching appeal and impact among his generation. And so like Duran and Kreskas, Albo was also a rabbinic and a communal leader in addition to being a philosopher. And he was most, or perhaps historically most well known, in addition for authoring the Sefer HaIkarim, for being a participant in the Tortoise Disputation. just like the disputation in Paris, and as well as the Barcelona disputation where the Rambam participated, the Tortoise Disputation was the third of the disputations that were really anti-Semitic demonstrations. This one took place in Tortosa, Spain in 1412, when Pope Benedict the 13th put the Talmud on trial in an effort to kind of publicly delegitimize Judaism and persuade the Jews in that generation to convert to Christianity. And they made all sorts of accusations against the Talmud, that the Messiah had already come. It attacked the anti-Christian sentiments within the Talmud. And essentially it put on this demonstration or this kind of quote unquote trial, even though it didn't give the defense attorneys, those defendants of the Talmud, really opportunity to defend the tenets of Judaism and to defend against the attacks that the Christians were leveling against the Talmud and against Judaism or Jewish theology. And so Albo, because he had this prominent political and rabbinic or communal position at the time, he was called upon to be one of the defendants of the Talmud. And because he wasn't afforded an opportunity to really voice his views, as well as he also realized from this disputation that his generation, his co-religionists, really had a lot of theological confusion, and they weren't really able to defend themselves against the Christian theological attacks. And he also realized, just even among his fellow rabbinic defenders of the Talmud, that they lacked uniformity in terms of their notions of dogma and in terms of the obligatory tenets of Judaism. So he saw, as a result of all of this in the Tortoise Disputation, he saw that there was this lack of uniformity, this lack of authoritative Jewish theology, and that's what motivated him to write down a systematic discussion of Jewish dogma so that all the Jews in his generation would have the ability to have a uniform understanding of Judaism and would be able to uniformly defend themselves and their faith against the attacks of the Christians. And he also felt that this had not been achieved previously, even though there were a number of his predecessors who attempted to systematize dogma. He felt that they weren't successful because there wasn't this uniform acceptance of their dogma. So we see in the Hakdama of his Sefer Karim, this is kind of his objective, and this is his motivation of writing the Sefer Karim. We see in the Hakdama, in the introduction of his Sefer Karim, he writes there lacked this uniformity, and there was all these different systems, but none of them had uniform or universal appeal or far-reaching accessibility. And so he says here in the introduction to how he's kind of set up his objectives in the Sefer Karim, he says, for a while they all agree, meaning all of his predecessors, his philosophical predecessors who attempted to delineate some sort of dogma, he says they all agree that it, namely the Torah, is divine. They differ not a little concerning the number of basic principles. Some saying there are 13, namely Rambam. Some say there are 26, namely David Bar Yom Tov. And some say that there are only 6. We saw that last week with Creskas's, Pinot, his cornerstones. But there is not one of these learned men who made any effort to explain those principles which pertain to a divine law generally, nor to whether there can be only one divine law. So Albo, in his efforts, not only wants to systematize Jewish dogma, but he wanted to put it in a more universal context. Albo explains that unaided human intellect can't fully determine which views are true and which actions are praiseworthy. So he argues that there's a need for divine guidance. And so he posits these principles, what he calls the ikarim, without which divine law cannot exist. And then he further delineates particular principles that are specific to Judaism, what he calls the branches or the anafim. So Albo encourages his generation to engage in an investigation of divine law by comparing the Torah to other sciences. And he argues that just as it's necessary for a doctor to know the principles of medicine, so too it's imperative, so too it's necessary for an adherent of religion to also understand its laws. So again, in the Hakdama, he makes this comparison by putting religion in the terms of science and putting in an investigation of religion in the context of the universal investigation. So he says here in the Hakdama, all the people that we know of in the world today possess a law. And it's inconceivable that a person should be subject to or identify with a law without knowing its principles or having some notion of them sufficient to induce belief in them. as we do not call a person a physician who does not know the principles of medicine. So Albo is going to articulate in his Haktama, in his introduction, the objectives, his goals of explicating these principles of divine law, and specifically identifying the divine character or the authenticity of the Torah within this category of divine law. So he says here, as we continue in the introduction, I've composed this book and called it the Sefer HaIkarim, the Book of Principles, because it investigates the principles of laws generally, and especially the principles of divine law. Then it investigates the principles of the law of Moses, concerning the divine character of which all agree, and shows that it is general principles appertaining to it in virtue of its character as divine, and special principles appertaining to it as being the particular divine law that it is. So first he wants to define what are the criteria of divine law, and then he wants to show against the other religions why Judaism is the authentic divine law and is worthy of one's adherence. So he enumerates first the general ikarim that are common to all divine law, and then he specifies the specific anafim that are particular to the Torah law. Okay, so he says this, and this is similar to what we've already seen in Duran, in the Rashbats a couple of weeks ago, when he kind of condenses Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikarim, his three Ikarim, into three basic categories or three principles. And so Albo does this a little bit later in book 1 of the Sefer Ikarim. He says the principles of divine law in general are three. Number 1, the existence of God. Number 2, divine revelation. And number 3, reward and punishment. So this is how Duran had kind of condensed or broken up the three component parts of Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikarim. Rambam doesn't have a hierarchy. All 13 seem to be of somewhat equal value. However, Duran says the first 5 can kind of fall under the umbrella of the existence of God. The next 4 can kind of fall under the rubric of revelation. The next 4, the final 4, kind of fall under the category of retribution or reward and punishment. So this is what Albo says. Similarly, the principles of divine law in general are 3. Number 1, existence of God. Number 2, divine revelation. Number 3, reward and punishment. And he says there's no doubt that these 3 are essential principles of divine law qua divine. For if we assume the removal of one of them, the law will fall entirely. This is obvious from the nature of the principles. Thus, if we do not believe in the existence of God who commands the law, there's no divine law. And if we do believe in the existence of God and do not believe in divine revelation, there's no divine law. And if there is no corporeal reward and punishment in this world and spiritual in the next, what need is there of divine law? Meaning the divine law helps us navigate in terms of our proper actions. So we see these 3 categories are similar to what we saw in Duran, but Albo explains them in a larger, broader context. Albo explains that a divine law is recognized as genuine if it fulfills 2 criteria. Number 1, if it is in accordance with the 3 principles, namely God's existence, revelation, reward, and punishment that are integral to the evaluation of such laws. And 2, if it's been proven that it was transmitted by a genuine divine messenger in a direct manner from God, namely revelation. So Albo argues that the test of the prophet must be as direct as it was in Moshe's revelation, when Bnei Israel actually saw him being addressed by God and God commissioning him with this message for them. So Albo goes on to reject the pretensions of the 2 other main religions, namely Christianity and Islam. He argues that the Catholic religion, the doctrine of Trinity, contradicts the divine unity, which is essential to the first of these 3 principles, the existence of God. And he argues against Islam by arguing that the Islamic messenger doesn't fulfill the criteria necessary for transmission of the divine law, because it wasn't proven that Muhammad was directly addressed by God and commissioned with a divine message. And also, a mass revelation comparable to that of Moshe on Sinai was not achieved by Jesus. It was not achieved by Muhammad, who both claim to have superseded Judaism. So Albo in his work shows that the law of Moshe, the Torah, is the only law that corresponds to these definitions of divine law. Thereby, he's proving the particularity of Judaism and the authenticity in Judaism in the context of universal laws. So Albo originally intended to write a one-volume work enumerating his system of Ikarim, of basic principles of divine law in general, and then enumerating the specific ones for Judaism. But then when he saw the needs of his generation, that wasn't sufficient, he went on to elaborate in the second treatise. That's an elaboration. He fleshes out the principle of the existence of God. In the third treatise, he fleshes out the principle of revelation. In the fourth treatise, he fleshes out the principle of reward and punishment and all the derivative principles that are derived from each of these Ikarim. Garth, you had something to add?
Yeah. So what's his basis for saying that Mohammed doesn't qualify as a messenger, whereas Moshe does? I mean, it's a separate point to say that in Judaism there was a revelation to a huge number of people. That's a separate point. But the first point, what's the difference between Muhammad and Moshe?
That's his point. That in order for it to be superseded, and he acknowledges that if that is the case for Mashiach, then Mashiach could surpass Moshe's Nebuah, and that's why he doesn't put the superiority of Moshe's Nebuah as one of the Ikarim like Rambam does. But that's his point, exactly what you said, that in order for it to be considered divine law, it has to have a mass revelation that is comparable, if not better, if not greater than Moshe's revelation at Sinai. And he says specifically with regard to Jesus and Muhammad, that they didn't, in terms of their revelation, they didn't supersede that. They didn't go beyond that. This is the quote that he uses in Sefer Karim. He says, the fact that a person claiming to be a prophet can walk on water, or divide a river and walk through it, or walk through fire without being burned, or can cure the sick or the lepers, is evidence of the fact that he is a worthy instrument for the performance of miracles, but it is not direct proof that he is a prophet, much less is it evidence that he was chosen to give a law. So that's how he would argue it. Yeah.
But I think that's a philosophically weak position. I mean, you can look at the Jewish experience of revelation and say, and then derive from the empirical power of a revelation to a mass of people, the fact that philosophically the only kind of revelation that's going to be considered revelation is a revelation to a mass of people. But I think that's a philosophically weak argument, because there can be no philosophical objection to the concept of one person receiving a revelation.
Right. What Albo, and we're going to see this later today, what Albo is doing is very much kind of reverting back to the more conservative doctrines of the earlier medieval Jewish philosophers like Yehuda Halevi and the Kuzari. And in the Kuzari, when the Yehuda Halevi, in the voice of the Khazar king, is investigating what is the proper religion. And he first goes to the Aristotelian philosophers, then he goes to Christians, then he goes to the Muslims, then ultimately he goes to the Jew, and the Jews were the despised faith in that early medieval period, and therefore he goes reluctantly to them only after he's not finding compelling evidence from the Christian and the Muslim. And basically he's arguing the exact same thing. He says, I don't believe in God who created I don't say I believe in God who created the world, because that's not something that is provable based on experience. I believe in the God who took the Israelites out of Egypt, who revealed, the Torah, and that kind of mass. It couldn't be that one person, it was just hearsay, claimed to have this revelation, or one person claimed to, have this supernatural miracle, performed through them. But it was something that was evident, or was witnessed by, the masses, and therefore it must be true. And that kind of, Halevi says, that transmission, that uniform transmission of the tradition from generation to generation, he says, is equal to experience. You're right from a philosophical perspective. However, from that more kind of a traditional conception of mass revelation and the uninterrupted tradition, that was compelling for, especially anti-Aristotelians. I'm not saying Albo is anti-Aristotelian, but it certainly is a compelling argument for, those who aren't, exclusively focused on the rational speculation.
But okay, to take my point like one step further, you could say, well, okay, all these Jews were at the base of Sinai, but the revelation was too much for them. So they basically appointed Moshe to go and receive the content of the revelation. So aren't we back to God communicating with one person?
The nature of it, but the fact that it happens, right? So maybe in terms of the particulars, yes, but the fact that it happened in such a way that was witnessed to some extent. Also, I mean, some will say that Bnei Israel heard the first two of the Aseret Dibrot, obviously that's subject to interpretation, but there is some sort of not just, there was some sort of revelation. It wasn't just hearsay from one individual. Yaakov, you had something to say?
Yeah, I guess similar point on, I definitely heard that argument given before, and I've heard of Nukzari. It makes a lot of sense, I guess, when compared to, let's say, like the Islamic, tradition or the Christian tradition. How does Albo handle how in the Jewish tradition we have other nevuah that's not mass revelation, but we still believe it to have been true? So, like, for example, Yonah, it wasn't, my understanding, it wasn't mass revelation. God came to Yonah. He said, you have to go tell the people of Nineveh to repent. But in the Jewish tradition, that's still considered a valid prophecy. That's still a divine will, even though it wasn't a mass revelation.
Sure. No, I mean, Albo very much believes in the significance of prophecy. And he's saying, even, in that quote from, about Jesus and Muhammad, it does show that they are, instruments for the performance of miracles, and even if one is able to achieve prophecy, and we'll see in his Ikarim, or not Ikarim, but the Shorashim and the Nafim, he does believe in prophecy, that one is able to be a prophet and achieve prophecy without it necessarily having, without it being a mass revelation. So there's no problem. And he also very much believes in supernaturalism. He's not like Rambam, that believes everything just happens naturalistically and it's just kind of dependent on one's intellectual development. So it's just that he believes in the supremacy of Moshe's Nebuah, specifically in Revelation at Sinai. But he then says, if Mashiach would come and he would have an even greater revelation, then he would accept that as superior to Moshe. He's arguing that in the past, those who claimed that, the Messiah had already came in, with Jesus or whatever, he's saying that didn't surpass Moshe's Nebuah, and therefore he argued that the Messiah has not yet come, despite the arguments by the Christians.
Thank you.
Okay, so Albo wrote a 4 treatise or 4-volume work, the Sefer Karim. And he wrote this in order to meet the needs of his generation, who really struggled with how to defend themselves against the Christians. And so each of these volumes, the first one, which we're going to look at together, delineates the 3 Karim that are common to all divine religions, the Shorashim, the derivative beliefs that are derived from the 3 principles, and then Anafim that are particular to Judaism. And so each of the volumes, so that all happens in the first volume, which was the initial one that he intended to write. But then when he saw he needed to flesh out to rectify the confusion among his co-religionists, he elaborated in each of the subsequent volumes, each devoted to one of the Karim and the derivative principles that follow from it. So the second volume is devoted to the existence of God and its derivative principles. The third volume is devoted to Revelation and its derivative beliefs. And then the third one is devoted to reward and punishment and its derivative belief. And so we see, however, within these later volumes, that it's not exclusively just the list. These are the Karim. This is what you have to believe. What's interesting about Albo's work is that incorporated in his book of principles, which is clearly a book on dogma, he incorporates a lot of homiletical interpretations, a lot of biblical drashot, in order to further develop and describe his Ikarim. And this idea of philosophical drashot was also something that was very common among these preachers, these communal leaders in 15th century Spain. These philosophers needed to relate to the masses in very accessible ways. And so they were not only philosophers studying and writing philosophical works, but they also were preachers that gave sermons and needed to, number one, bolster the faith and encourage the people of their generation, but also explain philosophical concepts in more accessible styles and more interesting styles and more engaging styles. And they often did that through the drashot. So actually, Sefer Karim, even though it's a book of principles, I actually wrote my PhD on this, my dissertation. I didn't really look at the system of dogma, but rather I looked at all of the ingenuity and the creativity in which he used philosophy in order to teach philosophical truths to his generation in very creative and homiletical ways, because that was a very important way to communicate sophisticated ideas to the masses. So for instance, in my book, I talked about how he focused on the theme of free choice, but used the theme, even though all of his generation was being religiously coerced by the Christians, he used very creative interpretations of biblical stories, like the hardening of Paro's heart, for instance, to actually teach the opposite belief, to actually teach the notion of free choice and how even the Jews of his generation have free choice in order to maintain their Judaism. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we get to his views on accidental heresy. Okay, so in his Thriya Karim, he explains that this is not an exhaustive list. It's not just, as Rambam said, it's these 13, and this is all that you're obligated in. But just like Duran, Albo really says that these are kind of three categories that he condenses Rambam's Yud Gimel Karim into, but really the believer is obligated in derivative principles as well. And so we see at the beginning of, or close to the beginning of the Sefer Karim in the first volume, we see him explain these general principles. And he says here, the truth of the matter, this is book 1, chapter 13, is that these three are general principles of all divine law in the sense that one who denies any one of them is excluded from the class of those who profess divine law and has no share in the world to come because he does not believe properly in divine law. But one may acknowledge these principles and yet have no share in the world to come. Why? He must in addition believe in the derivative principles which branch out of them. If he denies any of the subordinate principles, it's tantamount to a denial of the fundamental principle from which the former is derived. So not only does one have to believe in these three, existence of God, revelation, and reward and punishment, in order to achieve Chelek in Olam Haba, one also has to believe in these derivative principles. Because if you deny one of the derivative principles, what he calls the Shorashim, the root of the Ikarim, it says if one has denied the principle itself. So he says, thus one who believes in the first principle, the existence of God, must also believe in the derivative principles, that God is one, that he's incorporeal in any sense, or other such corollaries as follow from or are dependent upon the first principle. Similarly, one who believes in divine revelation, which is the second principle, must also believe in the reality of prophecy and in the genuineness of the divine representative's mission. Likewise, one who believes in the third principle, reward and punishment, must believe in God's knowledge and providence and in retribution, spiritual and corporeal. To deny any of the secondary principles which are derived from the fundamental principles or based upon them is tantamount to denial of the fundamental principle itself. Okay, so it's not just sufficient for an individual to believe in these three Ikarim that are based on Rambam's 13. That's not enough. You also have to believe, and it has the same obligatory status, the same seeming value. You also have to believe in the Shorashim, or the derivative principles. Okay, so he just gives kind of like a summary in that first chapter, but 2 chapters later, in chapter 15, he goes on and explicates them even further, similar, but yet distinct in certain ways to Rambam. So he says in chapter 15, the secondary principles based upon the 3 primary, which we have mentioned and derived from them, are 8. Okay, so we have 3 basic principles and then 5 more derivative principles. From the first principle, existence of God, are derived 4 secondary principles, including all those implied in the existence of God, who is a necessary existence. They're as follows: unity, incorporeality, independence of time, and freedom from defects. Think about Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikarim, if you remember, right? Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikarim, the first 5 were existence of God, unity, incorporeality. And then the 4th one was about his eternity. And the 5th, meaning that he would live on forever. And the 5th one was about that he's only the one that's appropriate to worship. He can't worship any of the intermediaries. So look at some of the distinctions here, right? Again, you have God's existence as the Ikar, and then the Chorashim, the derivative principles, unity and incorporeality, as we saw from Rambam. But here we have independence of time, which is a little bit distinct from Rambam, and also freedom from defects. Again, different than Rambam's 5th Ikar. Okay, the dogma based upon the 2nd principle, divine revelation, are 3: God's knowledge, prophecy, and the genuineness of the divine messenger. Again, some distinctions between Rambam, who very much focuses on the superiority of Moshe's Nebuah. Says this is the reason why we did not include the superiority of Moshe as a prophet among the principles, primary or secondary, meaning not among the Ikarim or the Shorashim, as Rambam did. For nothing should be regarded as a fundamental principle unless a divine law cannot be conceived without it, nor as a secondary principle unless it follows necessarily from a fundamental principle. But the superiority of Moshe as a prophet does not necessarily follow from a belief in the genuine character of the messenger, though it may be compared to a branch issuing from it. So he says the superiority of Moshe is particular to Judaism. It's one of the anafim, but it's not one of the karim or the shorashim. And then he sees the last category. As to the 3rd principle, reward and punishment, the secondary or the derivative principle, or the shoresh, which is prior and essential to it, is providence. Okay, so unlike Rambam, if you remember from Rambam, the last of the 4 Ikarim, what's missing here? There's no Mashiach and there's no Tchiyat HaMetim. The only things that he has here from those last 4 are the idea of retribution and divine providence, which Rambam doesn't state explicitly, talks more about divine omniscience, but we talked about that in its context.
What does he mean by providence?
So he means that there's some sort of God's care and concern for the individual. And it's not just in naturalistic terms, as we talked about a little bit earlier, when you were asking about the nature of God's providence with regard to Rambam's naturalistic scheme. It doesn't mean that man kind of taps into God's knowledge and thereby escapes, harm's way. And and that's kind of a conception of meriting divine providence. But Albo very much believes in the supernatural, in the ability for God to intervene, to protect, in the supernatural miracles, and doesn't necessarily follow Rambam's naturalistic position here. Again, more consistent with the later medieval Jewish philosophers like his teacher Kreskas. So Albo's division of Rambam's 13 into 3, and then the derivative principles seem to be influenced, like we saw in Duran, but his naming and his division of these shorashim, the derivative principles, seems to be somewhat unique. As I pointed out, right, Albo adopts the first 5 of Rambam's principles, but he somewhat changes the 4th, right, that it's not that God was, came before everything else, but rather he describes God being independent of time, to include the fact that he was eternal before and will be eternal after any of the other creations, right? Alba also changes Rambam's 5th Ikar to highlight God's perfection. It's not just about only God can be worshipped and not intermediaries, but it focuses that God is free from any defects. And whereas Duran just includes Rambam's principles 6, 7, and 9 in his 2nd category of revelation, Albo derives from Torah from heaven the derivative principles of God's knowledge, prophecy, and the authenticity of a prophet's mission. But Moshe's prophecy, or the immutability of the Torah, he doesn't consider to be a fundamental or a derivative principle because it's not essential to divine law, but rather he relegates these to anafim, to the branches of these beliefs that are just specific to the Torah, but not common to all divine law. And for the 3rd category also, for reward and punishment, he only describes providence, and he describes it not as a derivative, but rather as a prerequisite for reward and punishment. And so the Messiah, the belief in Messiah, or the belief in resurrection are not included because those aren't principles that are common to divine law. So in addition to the Ikarim and the Shorashim, Albo also lists 6 what he calls anafim, or branches, which are beliefs which everyone who professes the Torah is obligated to believe. So these are beliefs that are taught by the Torah, but they're not ikarim in the sense that they're not common to all divine law. So he enumerates this in a later chapter. And look at what he considers to be the anafim. Again, how it's similar or different from Rambam. There are 6 dogmas which everyone professing the law of Moses is obligated to believe. Creation ex nihilo, we saw that Rambam didn't, in the Parish Mishnah, at least in the original, did not enumerate that because the eternal universe was a very common belief in this in his time, and because of the Aristotelian influence. The superiority of Mosaic prophecy, that the Torah will not be changed, right? So 2 and 3, Rambam included in his 13 Ikarim. Human perfection, look at number 4 and how distinct that is from Rambam. Human perfection can be attained by fulfilling even a single mitzvah. It's totally different than Rambam, who focuses only on the intellectual perfection. And then 5 and 6 are consistent with Rambam, resurrection, and Messiah. And so Albo concludes by saying we did enumerate especially the 6 beliefs above mentioned, because, and this is just kind of a summary of them. He kind of explicates each of these in this paragraph. And that's what the dots are for. He says, we did enumerate especially the 6 beliefs above mentioned because they are accepted dogmas among our people necessary for the maintenance of the fundamental and derivative principles of the Torah. The fundamental of the Torah is dependent upon them, though they are not essential principles, since the law can exist without them, right? We could still believe in the Torah without believing in Mashiach. We could still believe in the Torah without believing in Tchias Metim. He who denies them is called a heretic, though he does not deny the Torah and has no share in the world to come. So Albo is saying that there is an obligatory status of these ikarim. However, they're not kind of pillars or cornerstones, as Prescott would say. It's not like the whole Torah would fall if you denied any of them. However, they are still obligatory beliefs. So like Kreskas, Albo has this hierarchical system, but Kreskas's first level is kind of the prerequisites or the presuppositions upon which belief in any Torah must be based, and that's the belief in God's existence. Albo's first level of these general beliefs that are common to divine law are totally different than Kreskas. And also, Albo deviates from his teacher with regard to these specific beliefs, this third level, these anafim. So as we said at the beginning, Albo certainly deviates from Rambam in certain ways, but he also deviates from Kreskas and the anti-Maimonideans in other ways. So even though we do see a lot of Rambam's influence on Albo, and we can kind of see the condensing of Rambam's 13 in Albo's 3, we do see him deviating in significant ways as well. And a further deviation is with regard to Rambam's conception of accidental heresy. So if you remember a few weeks ago, we looked at the final paragraph in his Perush Mishnayot after Rambam delineates all 13 of his Ikarim. And he says, if anybody denies any of these 13 Ikarim under any circumstances, seemingly, one is considered a heretic, one is excluded from Klal Yisrael, and one loses his chelek in Olam Haba. And we argued that wasn't necessarily stringent of Rambam, but that was just consistent with Rambam's conception of Olam Haba. For Rambam, as we saw in the last chapter of the Moreh Nevuchim, if one tries to perfect oneself, one needs to develop one's intellect in order to achieve human perfection. Human perfection is consequent upon one's intellectual development. The more one knows about God and about God's creation, the closer he can come to God, and the more he will merit immortality or communion with God in the intellectual state of Olam Haba. And so for Rambam, these 13 Ikarim, it wasn't a punishment if you deny any of them or if you doubt any of them, but rather these were just intellectual prerequisites to allow you to survive in Olam Haba. If you didn't have these proper conceptions of God, you didn't have the intellectual preparation in order to survive in Olam Haba. However, Albo's conception is very different. His conception of human perfection is totally different. For Albo, just like we saw last week for Kreskas, human perfection does not entail intellectual perfection, but rather human perfection is performance of the mitzvot. And so Albo, we see, similar to Kreskas, doesn't take this harsh stance that one needs these intellectual preparation, and otherwise one can't achieve a chelek olam haba. And so unlike Rambam, who doesn't seem to have any distinction between denying a belief intentionally versus denying accidentally. So because for Rambam, it's all the same. If you don't achieve intellectual perfection, regardless of the reason, regardless of the intention, you don't have what it takes to be an olam haba. But from what we saw from Duran last week, from what we saw, or what we kind of surmised from Kreskas last week, and what we're going to now see for Albo, they seem to have a different perspective, taking intentions into consideration, just like they were for halacha. Rashbat and Kreskas and Albo are all halachis, right? They all wrote shutim, responsa, and we're all concerned not just about the intellectual, but also the performance of the mitzvot. And just like there is this category of shkaga, of inadvertency, and a more lenient punishment, if any, for violating a halacha accidentally, so too they believe that there should be that same consideration for denying one of the beliefs accidentally. So have a look at Albo's interpretation of accidental heresy. So in the very second chapter of the Karim, of Sefer Karim, he says, every Israelite is obliged to believe that everything that is found in the Torah is absolutely true. And anyone who denies anything that's found in the Torah, knowing that it's the opinion of the Torah, is a heretic. But a person who upholds the Torah of Moshe and believes in its principles, but when he undertakes to investigate these matters with his reason and scrutinizes the text, is misled by his speculation and interprets a given principle otherwise than it is taken to mean at first sight, or denies the principle because he thinks that it does not represent a sound theory which the Torah obliges us to believe, or erroneously denies that a given belief is a fundamental principle, which however he believes as he believes the other dogmas of the Torah which are not fundamental principles, or entertains a certain notion in relation to one of the miracles of the Torah because he thinks that he is not hereby denying any of the doctrines which it is obligatory upon us to believe by the authority of the Torah. So he gives these different scenarios when one could come very earnestly to deny one of the Karim, either not knowing that it's Nikar or being led by his speculation to an erroneous belief. Look how he rules. A person of this sort is not a heretic. He is rather classed with the sages and pious men of Israel. Although he holds erroneous theories, his sin is due to error and requires atonement. So just like if one violates a halacha, he needs to atone for the halacha, meaning if one violates a halacha accidentally, he needs to atone. So too, if one comes to an erroneous belief, one needs to atone. But if you are well-intended and just were mistaken in the belief that you ultimately adopted, you need to rectify that belief, but you don't lose your chelek on olam haba. You're not considered a kofar. You just need to do tshuva. And so it seems from there that Albo takes a similar position to what we saw 2 weeks ago in Duran, a much more lenient position than what we saw in Rambam. However, scholars have argued over, is that in fact Albo's true belief with regard to accidental heretics? Because in the previous chapter, in the very first chapter of the Karim, he writes the following, and he says there, the investigation of fundamental principles is extremely dangerous. For anyone who denies one of the particular principles of the law is excluded from the group identified with that law. So in that first chapter, he doesn't seem to make any distinction between accidental versus deliberate. Anyone who denies one of the particular principles of the law is excluded from the group identified with that law. So we see that even though in that first excerpt that we read, which is chapter 2, Albo seems consistent with Duran, that one is obligated to accept all that the Torah teaches as true. But after accepting that, one's led to a wrong belief, one's not a heretic, one doesn't lose his chelek in olam haba. We see that that seems to be contradicted by the second chapter that we just read, which is really the first chapter, where he says that the investigation of a fundamental belief is extremely dangerous. And so Menachem Kellner argues that must still, if you come to deny any of the Karim, it must still constitute, regardless of intention, it must still constitute heresy. Otherwise, what would be extremely dangerous about investigating the principles if unintentional denial wouldn't be punished? So Kellner suggests that Albo included Duran's position, right, in that first excerpt that we read, in order to avoid identifying all of his scholarly Jewish predecessors, like Duran, as heretics for holding different views of dogma. So Kellner suggests that Albo's earlier statement, right, from the first chapter, the second one that we read, reflects Rambam's position regarding the obligatory nature of dogma and the consequential punishment for denial. But the more lenient excerpt, the one that we read first, which is really in the second chapter, is an expression of Albo's reluctance to maintain Rambam's position. Another modern Jewish philosopher, Eliezer Schweid, argues that Albo's seeming leniency regarding accidental heresy contradicts a later chapter, in chapter 13, in which Albo discusses the obligation to accept all of the derivative principles without any mention of exceptions for individuals who have limited rational capacities or who are misled to erroneous beliefs. And he says there in chapter 13, the one who believes in the first principle, the existence of God, must also believe that God is one and incorporeal in any sense. It follows, therefore, that one who says that God is a body or corporeal power virtually denies the principle of the existence of God. So Schweid interprets Albo's leniency in that excerpt that we just read as a challenge to Maimonides' rationalism, while in this latter chapter, in chapter 13, it reflects his attack on the Christian irrationality, specifically affirming the divine corporeality that's represented in Jesus. So it seems that this contradiction can be reconciled by interpreting the more stringent views as Albo's affirmation of the results of deliberate denial. If you deliberately deny any of these ikarim, you are punished with being deprived of your chelik olam haba. But by contrast, if you accidentally deny what we saw in chapter 2, any of these beliefs, and you're earnestly misled, they don't constitute heresy. You don't deserve punishment. You just need to do tshuva. And so later in his discussion of the accidental heresy, Albo states explicitly, he who knows the truth and deliberately denies it belongs to the class of the wicked, whose repentance is rejected. But he whose intention is not to rebel, not to depart from the truth, nor to deny what is in the Torah, nor reject tradition, but whose sole intention is to interpret the verses according to his opinion, though he interprets them erroneously, he's neither a sectarian nor a heretic. So it seems that Albo's lenient attitude towards unintentional heresy, it seems that that's consistent with his views about the limits of human rationality, right? He argues that human mind is limited. And how can he then condemn those who arrive at false beliefs due to some sort of speculative error? So Albo's ruling on accidental heresy may reflect also the needs of his generation, right? He was a public preacher. He was a communal leader. He was a political leader in a really, really trying time for his generation. So Albo may have also, through this more lenient stance, may have also been trying to dissuade the oppressed Jewish community from succumbing to the pressures of the Christian. He may have wanted to articulate to those who have been persuaded or those who have been coerced by the other religions that they can still repent and that their erroneous beliefs that they may have been led to don't necessarily constitute heresy, and they can still come back to correct their erroneous beliefs and return and do tshuva, return to Judaism. So Albo's deviation from Rambam's extreme rationalism, including his, objection to Rambam's take on accidental heresy, that was really characteristic of a lot of the Jewish philosophers in this last period of the Middle Ages. The late medieval Jewish philosophers were deeply involved in defending conservative theistic doctrines in an effort to kind of combat the attacks of the Christian theologians and the criticisms of the radical philosophers at the time. And so the 15th century Jewish philosophers like Albo return to the less radical, more moderate, rationalistic conclusions of many of the earlier medieval Jewish philosophers like Saadia Gaon, like Yehuda Halevi, who we spoke about before in the Kuzari, in their defense of Judaism. So Albo and his philosophical contemporaries stressed the limits of human knowledge and objected to Rambam's notion that rational speculation constitutes the purpose of the Torah, and only through intellectual perfection can one achieve human perfection. Instead, like we saw with Kreskas last week, Albo argued that faith, that performance of the mitzvot, that proper kavanah, that fear of God, not the intellectual development, is what constitutes human perfection, is what enables one to connect with God. It's what enables one to merit immortality in Olam Haba. So whereas Aristotle and Rambam argue that the individual can develop his own intellect, Albo argues that the human's intellect is somewhat limited, and therefore it required divine law to guide the individual both to the proper truth in his conceptions, but also to the proper practice, to the proper conduct. And so he rejects intellectual perfection as the ultimate form of human perfection, because that would only be attainable by a slight, minority. And he felt that God would never make the desired purpose of humanity only achievable by the elite, but rather everyone, he believed, had the ability to reach spiritual perfection. And therefore, everybody needed to have the ability to perform the mitzvot in order to, and have these conceptions of God in order to achieve a chelek b'olam haba. Now, even though Albo was consistent in many ways with Kreskas' teacher, the 15th century Jewish philosophers, Albo and his contemporaries, were not as anti-Maimonidean or anti-Aristotelian as Kreskas. So even though they did oppose the radical Aristotelian trends, they weren't willing, despite their theologically conservative leanings, to adopt an anti-rationalist approach that denied the value of philosophical study. And therefore, Albo felt the need to deviate from the extreme views that emerged from Rambam's school, which brought him closer to the positions of Kreskas, but at the same time, he needed to oppose those anti-Aristotelian, those very kind of Christian schools of thought that brought him back to the more Aristotelian or rational way. So Albo kind of towed both lines and kind of tried to have this median position of being more conservative than the radical rationalists of Rambam, but also less anti-rationalist than the anti-Aristotelians like Kreskas. And so it's this kind of middle path, this more moderate stance, Albo tries to navigate in his Sefer Karim. So we definitely see the significance of Rambam's influence and the pervasive nature of the influence of Rambam's Yud Gimel Karim, but we also see him deviating from Rambam's notion, especially with regard to accidental heresy, and taking a more conservative approach that's more in line with the anti-Maimonideans. And so it's interesting to see how Albo navigates and kind of presents this dialectical tension, sometimes very much reflecting Rambam's influence, sometimes very much deviating from it as he proceeds in this particularly hostile time, both philosophically as well as historically, in the late 15th century Spain. We're going to look at a final medieval Jewish philosopher, and he was significantly influenced by Rambam next week. We're going to look at Isaac Abravanel in his Rosh Hashanah. We talked about him briefly with regard to his defense of Rambam's stance on accidental heresy, but we'll put that in his philosophical context in his system of dogma next week, before we get to the modern discussions of dogma and the contemporary philosophical debate over whether or not there are obligatory beliefs and what in fact those may or may not be, when we get to the controversy that erupted when Kellner published his book about 20 years ago, and the different voices among contemporary Jewry for or against his position. I wish you all a good week. I look forward to seeing and learning with you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.